The books of Chronicles, which immediately precede Ezra and Nehemiah in our English Bibles, related how the people of Judah, because of their disobedience to God, had seen their country laid waste and their capital city, Jerusalem, with its temple, destroyed at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. The people themselves had been taken into exile. In due course, however, and in fulfillment of God's word by Jeremiah, a new imperial power arose in Mesopotamia, which saw fit to allow the Jewish exiles to return to their ancestral land. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah explicitly take their cue from 2 Chronicles by repeating almost verbatim the final 2 verses of that book. If Chronicles, in its last chapter, tells us that God acted in mercy by restoring his people, Judah, Ezra and Nehemiah will reveal to us how they fared upon their return, privileged with a new opportunity to be God's people in their own land. Welcome back, everybody, to the So We Speak podcast. This is Cole Fakes, and I'm doing my best Star Wars opening impression here with this quote from Gordon McConville, which just is exactly the way you would tell this if it were The Empire Strikes Back. And I love the wording in there, a new imperial power, which we've been talking about, the shifting powers of the world that in God's providence return his people right back to the promised land where they were before in something of a new start for the people of Israel.
Indeed, in our last episode, we talked about Ezra the priest who comes back with the exiles to Jerusalem, and as a priest and a scribe, he is very interested in restoring the covenant relationship, particularly through the priestly aspects of that. In other words, we're back, and what do we do now? Well, we're still God's people, so let's act like it. And Ezra says, I'm going to show you what it looks like to act like God's people. Nehemiah, though, Cole, is not a priest. He's not a pastor. He doesn't work for a church. He's a regular old business guy. In fact, he's pretty high up in the Persian court. And he gets drawn into this not for religious reasons, but for different reasons.
Yes, if Ezra is our Obi-Wan Kenobi here, I'm going to say that Nehemiah is our Han Solo, who comes back out of the business world to lead his people. I don't know if he's a Luke Skywalker type, because he doesn't have the formal roles that you see in either Ezra or in the books of Haggai and Zechariah. You see Zerubbabel, you see Joshua the high priest. Nehemiah is kind of a different leader than these people. He's the closest thing we have in the Bible to a business leader, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, actually, whenever you talk about the book of Nehemiah, or whenever you hear it preached, you hear one of two things, sometimes both. You basically hear Nehemiah taught as a leadership manual. I've heard it this way. I've taught it this way. It's a great way to think about Nehemiah. There's a lot of great leadership lessons here. And I want to think about maybe what else there is in the book of Nehemiah. But the other time you hear this is during a building campaign. There's no better building campaign book in the Bible than Nehemiah. If you're building a building, why not preach on building a wall? Right. And all the tactics that Nehemiah, he even does a little, everybody plays a role. It's great for a fundraiser. But these are kind of the way that you hear Nehemiah taught. And I wanted to ask you, because I know you've taught on Nehemiah fairly recently, do you think this is the major theme, the only theme? How would you approach Nehemiah in terms of being a leadership book?
That's a great question. I do think, to me, from a leadership perspective, I think there are clearly leadership ideas here. One is the sanctity of everyone's work. Nehemiah comes to God's work bringing the skills that he has in the business world. To me, there's no better example of that than you, me, everybody we talk to saying, you don't have to be a pastor to do kingdom work. Everybody does kingdom work. To me, that's powerful. Then the specific tactics, they're good, they're smart, they'll sell books, but I don't see that as the major theme. I really see the opening. I'll tell you what really catches me, Cole, is that in chapter 1, Nehemiah is serving at the high position in the court. Brother comes to him and says, the remnant in Jerusalem is in shameful conditions. The walls of Jerusalem are broken down and its gates are destroyed and the people are defenseless, and it's a horrible situation. And then listen to what he says. This is Nehemiah in verse 4. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. one of the big things to me is, do I have a heart for God's people and God's work like Nehemiah did? That probably right off the bat hits me as one of the great lessons.
Yeah, I think in the book of Ezra, you have a relatively straightforward history. You have some chronology, you have some census data, and then you have a description of what happens with Ezra and the exiles. Nehemiah, though, even though these are one book in the Hebrew Bible, Nehemiah is very different in terms of its genre. It's really the private journals of Nehemiah. In fact, he adds all these little asides, these prayers, thoughts that he has. He records what he's doing. And for that reason, you see into the motives and the heart and the prayers of Nehemiah in a way that you don't see anywhere other than maybe the Psalms give you insight into David, or Jeremiah, for example, a prophet, gives you an insight into their life. And so I would say, yes, Nehemiah, wonderful leader. There's a lot of tactics that we can learn from. There's principles that if you follow these, it will improve your leadership. All of that is good. But to the point that you're making, I think this is the thing not to miss when you read Nehemiah. The point of Nehemiah as it is written is that you can see into the heart of someone who is working for the Lord. And he's facing what seems like an insurmountable task. He's facing difficulty. He's facing a shortage of resources. He's facing criticism. He's trying to lead the people logistically and spiritually. He encounters all these issues, but you don't see them in terms of like a case study. You see them in terms of the journal of the leader himself. That's why the prayers in Nehemiah and the little asides of Nehemiah and the self-talk that you get exposed to in the book, I think are most important in studying Nehemiah. You really get the sense of the man, of the person, rather than his tactics or skills.
I agree. He is so much like Jesus in some interesting ways. I mean, I don't know if we think of him as foreshadowing Jesus, like David foreshadowed Jesus, but he is so much like Jesus. I mean, he weeps over the fate of his people, and I can think of Jesus in Gospel of Luke weeping over Jerusalem, and then you see Nehemiah praying, and of course Jesus we overlook it, but he's constantly praying in the Gospels. And there's a sense in which it would be one thing to say that you and I are emulating Jesus. He sort of emulates Jesus 450 years before Jesus. So in that sense, he is foreshadowing the character of Jesus.
Yeah, we get three major prayers from Nehemiah in the book, three lengthy prayers, but then we get all these little, some people call them arrow prayers, where he just throws up a quick prayer. So in the beginning, in chapter 1, we get one of the best prayers in the Bible. Nehemiah chapter 1, he's pouring out his heart to God. He's confessing the sins of his people. He's asking God for favor when he approaches the king to go back to Jerusalem. And he does this for, anywhere from 3 to 5 months. I mean, this is a long process of praying, fasting, and waiting. And then after he goes in to meet with the king, he throws up this very short prayer that's really built on that large reservoir of prayer that he's been doing in his own time. And that's actually something that you see with Jesus. Jesus obviously is not like Nehemiah in the sense that he is not sinful. He completely, totally depends on God. And Nehemiah, I'll just mention this as kind of a side note because we don't have time to go into it. Nehemiah is one of the few Bible characters that we see where you get kind of an upfront look at some of his lesser qualities. I mean, you get this with David, but usually we read about the good things that Bible characters do. Nehemiah, a lot of people think that when he has those people beaten and tears out their hair and stuff at the end, they think that this is sinful. There's some commentators that disagree with that, and I might be sympathetic to the fact that he's not sinning. But you see him in his human, odd, tired, frustrated persona. You never see Jesus sinning, but what you do see in both of them is this total dependence and surrender in their prayer life. Jesus, when he gets physically tired, retreats to pray. Jesus, when he is in a situation where he is modeling for the disciples dependence on God, he prays out loud so they can hear him. Same thing's happening with Nehemiah. He's got this rich prayer life behind the scenes, but
Right.
then he does a great job of leading the people publicly in prayer when they need it. And you can see a parallel between the two of them. Even as all of the examples we mentioned about types of Christ, they're imperfect people. They're not exactly like Jesus, but you can see some qualities of Jesus in there.
Yeah, I agree. I can think of 3 arrow prayers right now that totally stuck with me from his life. In chapter 1, as he's about to go in and see the king, he says, Lord, give me favor with this man. I have prayed that prayer myself a lot. Then later, when the enemies are going to attack him, they don't have the wall built, he says, so we said a prayer and posted a guard. And that's a phrase that stuck with me. And then later, when his enemies are trying to get him into political trouble with the king, he prays, Lord, strengthen my hands for the task ahead. He's so many memorable little prayers like that. It reminds me of Jesus' prayers are better, bigger, but I remember a lot of Nehemiah's prayers.
Well, think of his prayer at the very end of the book. Lord, remember me in the good that I've done.
Yes.
It's a great little arrow prayer.
It is. You think about Nehemiah, you have to put him in his context. He leaves, and this is how I think, Cole, he probably most foreshadows Jesus. He is in a position of privilege, authority, and comfort. He's like way up there in the Persian kingdom. His heart breaks for the plight of his people. He leaves the comfort and power and privilege of the court to go down to Jerusalem and help his people build the wall to save them and deliver them. And you think, who does that sound like? That is Philippians 2. Jesus, even though he was equivalent to God, didn't hold on to that, but emptied himself, took on the form of a servant, was obedient even unto death on a cross. In a sense, he foreshadows that. And so I tend to look at Nehemiah whenever he's praying to God, like, remember me and how much I put up with from these knuckleheads. He prays those prayers a lot, and I think, if I remember where he came from, I can understand his human frustration.
Yes, very human and great encouragement to us. But I love that parallel you pointed out with Jesus, that kenosis passage. Came from glory, emptied himself, became the form of a servant, and then was exalted in the end. That's a pattern that God likes, clearly. He does it over and over and over again. One of the things that sticks out to me, I've taught Nehemiah several times, and one of the things, the more I study it, the more interesting this becomes to me, is how he deals with his enemies. He deals with several different levels of criticism. He has criticism from the outside, which would be Sanballat and Tobiah. These are 2 of the several people that are on his borders, and they are criticizing and threatening him. He deals with criticism from the people. They have an internal loss of morale. When they're building the wall, there's a small mutiny that takes place. I'm always impressed with the shrewdness of Nehemiah. And this is a lesson for us. It's another way that he helps us to see something about Jesus. Jesus deals with his enemies in interesting ways. He engages with the Pharisees, and then he remains silent at certain times and allows false accusations to stand. He resists the devil head to head in the temptation, and then he appears at least to succumb to the enemy's great move of the crucifixion. But of course, that was for his purpose. There's a wisdom in how to deal with his enemies, and he doesn't do the same thing every time, and neither does Nehemiah. Nehemiah knows when to confront his enemies and when to ignore them, and when to rally the people, and when to allow things that are unfair to stick. And I think of one of the scenes in chapter 6 where Sanballat and Tobiah are threatening again. And this time what they've done is they have spread false information about Nehemiah. They've said, oh, Nehemiah actually wants to become a king. He wants to take over the place. He's got these selfish ambitions. Don't trust Nehemiah. In fact, in chapter 6, they even hire a false prophet to give a prophecy about Nehemiah. And Nehemiah has confronted them several times at this point. But here he does something different. He says in chapter 6, verse 3, this is one of my favorite lines in the book. They say, why don't you just go meet with them? I mean, all they want is a meeting. How can you refuse to even hear out the other side? And Nehemiah says, I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? This is such a great example of sometimes God's work is too important to get sidetracked with other stuff. You don't, there's the wise saying, let sleeping dogs lie. Sometimes that is just what you need to do. And you don't have to make a response. You don't have to get sidetracked, because that's what the enemy really wants, is they want to keep you from doing what God called you to do. And Nehemiah just says, I have a great work. I'm doing a great work, and I cannot come down right now. I'm too busy doing what God called me to do. There's many times where Jesus does that. And he does it in counterintuitive ways. Do you remember the time that Jesus is healing, and he says that he's got to go to the next town, and the people are upset that he's leaving because there's, I would assume, more people to heal, and people who are hungry, and there's important people there. And you can imagine somebody standing around saying, look at Jesus. He didn't even care about these people. There's plenty more people to heal here. But Jesus says, but for this purpose, this is my purpose, to proclaim the kingdom. And so I must go into the other towns and villages and proclaim the kingdom. See, Jesus had that same quality of knowing what God called him to do and not allowing himself to get sidetracked when his enemies are criticizing or tempting or whatever they're doing. And because of that, he's very effective in the kingdom of God, just like Nehemiah is. There's no way Nehemiah gets this project done if he has to deal with all the threats and criticism that he's facing. In fact, they build the wall in record time, partly because Nehemiah refuses to get caught in any of these traps.
Right. That's a very good point. And Jesus certainly does that too. That clarity of purpose is a great takeaway, not just for leaders. It's not just a leadership lesson, but I think we can all use that in our lives, as having the clarity of purpose and let the main thing be the main thing. There are times when you need to go deal with the side issues, but you know how easily you can get sidetracked with the side issues. And Nehemiah does a really good job. I mean, they build this wall in record time, and no one thought it could be built at all. I mean, when you read this, I remember reading it, and you get the enemies who are going to attack them. You get the difficulty with the political campaign of stop the work, this isn't legal, injunctions being filed with the district courts.
Right.
I mean, you have everything in Nehemiah, and you get to the end, and they go in 70 days, they built the wall, and you think, what? That is amazing. I thought this whole process I just read took years, and yet they're able to do this in unbelievable time because he stayed focused.
That's right. The last thing that sticks out to me in Nehemiah is the climactic scene of Nehemiah is the same as Ezra, and this is where Nehemiah and Ezra come together, because when they finish the wall, they renew the covenant. And in chapter 8, 9, and 10 in Nehemiah, you see the covenant renewal ceremony. And part of what happens at that ceremony is Ezra comes and delivers the word to the people. And there's actually some really interesting discussion on what he reads, because it says that he reads the law for half a day in the morning, which my personal opinion on this is that he's reading the book of Deuteronomy or something very similar. Maybe a shorter version of certain pieces. I don't know if he reads the whole thing, but he's certainly reading something like the book of Deuteronomy before the people. And of course, they are cut to the heart. They recommit themselves. Nehemiah and Ezra and the priests and the Levites help the people turn their hearts back to the Lord. That's the key theme, the big scene at the end of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah, it says, when he was governor, Ezra, they read the word, and in chapter 8, verses 9 and 10, it says that when they read the law, all the people are weeping. And they say, this day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep, for all the people wept as they heard the words of the law. And then they said, go your way, eat the fat, and drink sweet wine, and send portions to anyone who has nothing ready, for this day is holy to our Lord. And do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. And I've always loved this verse. In fact, this was our wedding verse that you preached on at our wedding. And it's not exactly what you think it is on the surface. The Bible does talk about the joy of the Lord generically all over the place. I mean, just the joy of knowing Him, the joy of being with Him. But here it means something a little bit different, and this is where we get, I think, maybe the final picture of Jesus in the book of Nehemiah. This is the joy that only comes from being convicted of sin and experiencing the forgiveness and grace of God. There's a joy. It's counterintuitive, but if you followed God for very long, you know this. When you are convicted of your sin and you don't blame somebody else or ignore it or debate whether or not it's sinful, all the little things that we do to get away from conviction. If you will actually receive conviction for your sin, own it in your heart, confess it to God, be forgiven of it, and restored to fellowship with God through Jesus Christ, there is a unique joy in that you really can't get anywhere else. It's the joy of a clear conscience. It's the joy of restoration. It's the joy of being right with God and knowing that there's nothing separating you from God. That's the joy they're talking about here. It's the people who go through the conviction of, we have not lived up to the covenant the way that we said we would, and we deserved to be exiled, is what they basically arrive at. But God has been faithful to His promises. He has forgiven us. He's made a way. We're going to reconsecrate ourselves to Him. We're going to celebrate the feast, and we're going to be right with God again. And what Ezra and Nehemiah recommend to the people is, don't stop your weeping. Do the confession, accept what you've done, but also enjoy the forgiveness of God. The joy of the Lord, the joy of being forgiven in the Lord is your strength. And there's hardly a line in this book that applies more to Christians than this. The joy of the Lord is your strength. And not just the generic joy of the Lord, the joy of being made right with God through Christ is your strength. And this is a great little gospel picture in the Old Testament.
Really is. And that kind of full circle to why this is more than a leadership book. It's fine to teach it as a leadership book, but if you think about it, he built this wall in 52 days. I think I misspoke earlier. But I mean, this short period of time, 52 days to build the wall. And then think about how long it took then to restore the people's spiritual life. Their physical life was relatively easy, and short. But the true thing that they were there to do, Nehemiah probably didn't realize he was going there to build more than a wall. He was going there to rebuild the people as well. And you're right. It was an easy thing to build the wall compared to rebuilding their spirit. And they end up going from, if you think about it, where are the Israelites at the beginning of this book? They're ashamed, they're weak, they're looked down upon, and Nehemiah comes, and now here at the end of the book, where are they? Yes, they have a wall, but even more importantly, they have peace with God. They have reconciliation with God, and they've turned their hearts back to Him. So it couldn't be a more stark difference from where they started to where they ended.
That's right. Yeah, they have a wall around their city, but they have a covenant around their people.
Exactly.
Again, and that sets the stage for the New Testament. It's funny because in our Bibles, the order, we still have tons to come in the Old Testament, but in the chronology, when the curtain closes in Nehemiah, you're there. This is the last that you see, basically, with the book of Malachi. This is the last you see of Israel before the curtain opens in the New Testament. But as we are following the Old Testament, we are actually going to go parallel in time, or slightly back in time, to the only book of the Bible that doesn't mention God. And somehow we are going to see Jesus in that book as well. That will be the book of Esther next time on the So We Speak podcast.